Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our program this evening. It's such a pleasure to see everyone here together today. My name is Julie Gaffney, and I serve as Assistant Vice President for Strategic Mission Initiatives in the Division of Mission Integration and Ministry. And I also have the deep pleasure of serving as the Executive Director of the Center for Community Engaged Learning here at Fordham. So I want to begin tonight, before we get into this remarkable panel of experts to talk about some really pressing issues facing us. I want to take a moment to acknowledge the tragedy this week in Mexico, in which at least 38 individuals lost their lives and many more have been hospitalized. So I'd like to just take a moment together to welcome these families, these individuals into our hearts as we begin this conversation about faith, about displacement, about migration, and about our own lived experiences. So thank you for that. So the Center for Community Engaged Learning and the Division of Mission Integration here at Fordham really tries to serve as a convener for conversations, for celebrations, to address challenges, to build solutions, and to bring people together, members of the Fordham community, students, faculty, administrators, together with community leaders, community members, public officials, the strategists, the members of this vibrant New York City community, and indeed our national and international communities that really make the experience here at Fordham, the educational experience, but also the experience of civic engagement to be so powerful. And so we are always looking to build conversations like the one that you will hear tonight, an exchange of ideas, an exchange of perspectives, out of which we can all become stronger and we can work together to address the most pressing issues and challenges facing us, and also to celebrate together in who we are and where we want to go, what we want to become. So I'm incredibly grateful to everyone here tonight for your part in this project of partnership, in this work of hospitality and welcoming. And I'm particularly grateful to the members of community organizations who are here with us today, who have welcomed our students into their work, into sacred spaces like the Kane Street Synagogue and the Masjid Muhammad Ali Islamic Center, as I know many members of Professor Kueny's class visited, who are here with us tonight and who have worked so hard to put this panel together, along with members of the Center for Community Engaged Learning and of the Division of Mission Integration. This is really central to the work of building community solutions in New York, and that's what we all want to be taking on together. I want to issue a really warm welcome and a thanks to our panelists who are with us today, to our moderator, Eileen Markey, to our panelists, Adama Ba, Professor Bharat Elman, to Shivani Parekh, to Miriam Ford, and then also to Professor Muhammad Abdul Rahman, who will be calling us to prayer later on in the program. So we're so grateful to have you and to learn from you this evening. This month has seen the celebrations of Holi, of Ramadan. Next week, Jews and Christians will enjoy two of their greatest annual festivals. So it's a moment where many of us are coming together around festivals of faith. And that's really where the Division of Mission Integration came up with this idea of a set of programs to celebrate our faith and to imagine what interfaith, multi-faith, faith exchange can look like at Fordham and also in our community work. So we're really pleased to have this program and this course take part in this Faith Fest. And a huge thank you especially to my colleague Kujeji Kamara, who's sitting here off stage, who is the architect of this event and of so much of the really powerful work of the Center for Community Engaged Learning and the Division of Mission. And thanks also to the other members of the division who have worked really hard to put this event together today, and who work every day to address questions of faith and justice here at Fordham and here in New York. So without anything else from me, I want to turn things over to this fantastic panel and to the conversation that we'll have this evening. So thanks so much.
Hi, everyone. As Julie said, thinking about the fire in Juarez, thinking about the camps on the Mexican side of the border growing again, right, refilling, growing again of late, it's timely that we gather like this together. And, you know, just a few weeks after Holy, as our Muslim neighbors observe Ramadan, as the Christians accompany Christ in the clarifying desert of Lent, as Jews prepare to reenact the Passover, perhaps we harried and multitasking New Yorkers even can find ourselves wrapped in the time and the priorities of the divine. And so reflect on how the divine asks to be welcomed in each new era, in each new fleeing refugee, in each new arriving migrant. But frankly, time out of time or not, as the earth continues to warm, forests move to savannas, savannas move to deserts, sea levels rise, water grows more scarce in the global south, the high numbers of people that we've seen arriving this past year will be less of an anomaly and more of a constant. Whatever policies, open or tight, this administration or the next federal administration takes, the era of mass migration is here. In this hemisphere, and going from Africa to Europe, right? From the global south of Latin America to the north, and from Africa to Europe, people are moving, people are on the move, and people are on the move because they can't stay home because the globe is too warm and they can't grow food in many of the places, and this leads to conflict, and people have to leave, right? This is very meta, but not a problem of 2022 or 2023. It's a reality of the future. So this isn't a passing crisis. This is the future on a planet that is in pain. So, as people formed by the moral teachings and the spiritual vision of our faiths, how do we respond? How do the texts that we study and that we pray guide us in our actions? So I want to start the conversation with these fabulous guests by thinking about that initially, and maybe we can just start from left to right. That initially we go to our text, so I'll simply ask, what does your faith's book say about the migrant?
Well, thank you. So much of what you said resonates deeply with me. People being on the move has been something for millennia. And the Jewish story, of course, starts with that, with Abraham leaving Ur in what is now Iraq and going to another place. And of course, Passover, our story right now, where we are strangers in a land, and a land that actually doesn't want us or wants to exterminate us after having exploited us. And then we are traveling to a new place that's been promised to us. So the story of traveling, of being a stranger, of being a migrant is really at the essence of Judaism. And in fact, in the Torah, which is one of the 3 books of our holy text, the Tanakh, in the Torah, 36 times we're told that you must love the stranger, you must care for the stranger, do not harm the stranger, be generous with the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt and you know the heart of the stranger. So it's really, it is one of the essential elements of Judaism to be concerned for the people who are trying just to, either flee war or flee dangers from neighbors, or find a place to work. All of those motivations, it is incumbent upon me as a human and me as a Jew to do what I can.
Yeah, can you hear me? Okay. You know, in Islam is this something similar. The Prophet ﷺ, when he was being persecuted in Mecca, he left to Medina, and he was a stranger. He didn't know what was going to happen to him in this new land. And in fact, he was welcomed. They even sang songs welcoming him and praising him and leading him the way into Medina. And one of the texts that I loved, it says, a man asked Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam, whose Islam is good, or what sort of deeds or what qualities of Islam are good? The Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam could have said anything, but he said, to feed others and to greet those whom you know and those whom you do not know. He could have said, oh, just give charity and that's it. But we must greet the strangers. And oftentimes when I'm doing this work, people, the ones that I greet, don't look like me. They don't speak the language I speak. It's okay. They need my help. That's why I'm there.
Sure. So I would say that Hinduism, not being a religion that's tied to any particular text, probably still nonetheless has two that are the most salient. There are two great epics. There's one that's the Ramayana, the other one is the Mahabharata. Both are longer than the Iliad and the Odyssey, so I'm going to do my very best to abrogate a lot of context while also sticking to the answer here. So in the Ramayana, Ram, who has 3 other brothers, is destined to be the king and the successor of his father. His father had 3 wives. And so one of the wives, who was not his mother, but rather, I guess you could frame her as a stepmother of sorts, was jealous that Ram would become the next king and not her one son, Bharat. And so she banished Ram to the forest upon the king's demise. And so Ram brings his wife Sita and one of his brothers, Lakshman, into the forest. Their devoted, faithful servant, Hanuman, the monkey god, as many may know him, went alongside him. And this 14 years in the forest were ones where they were received by the forest people, and they were taken care of them with the understanding that they were, though temporary refugees, also royal refugees. But with the knowledge that though their accommodations would never meet the ones that they previously had, the humility that Ram and Sita and Lakshman had to accept though the injustice of their reality, the beauty of the offers that those who received them were still giving them within their capacity. And there's a lot to be held within that, because many times refugees and asylum seekers not only come to the United States, which in theory has many resources, but sometimes end up in parts of the country where many folks are not sure how to respond. And so how do we model the best of American values, the best of trying to make our resources available to folks, even if sometimes they feel limited. The other story is the Mahabharata, which I'm again going to try to hone in on the essence there, but there are 2 warring clans, the Kauravas and the Pandavas. The Kauravas are 100 brothers who will not be able to accede to the throne because their father has a disability, and ableism was prevalent in the ancient times. So the Pandavas' father is in such a position that his sons will be the ones to be royalty. So they're cousins. They're all cousins. The Kauravas, through many means of trickery, are able to have the Pandavas be forced out of the throne of the kingdom, and they're forced to kind of migrate into the far margins of the kingdom instead. And so they're constantly being felt as if they have less and less, and ultimately that leads to the famed Kurukshetra War and the Bhagavad Gita, which is probably the book that most people have heard of from Hinduism. In these cases, similarly, there are the peoples of the margins of the kingdom, again, who do not have much, but who recognize the honor of to be able to host royalty, give the 5 brothers what they can. The other essence here that's very important is that not all of them are necessarily politicized. Some of them might even believe that the Kauravas would be better leaders than the Pandavas. But rather it is their obligation to be good hosts, because that was like the moray of the time. And so I think really, though, what both stories kind of depict, rather than showing particular values that are given from any like God-given directive, are more about what does it mean to be an accommodating host? What does it mean to be a dedicated member of society in spite of the inequities and in spite of limitations?
Yeah, thank you.
So in the Catholic faith tradition, we know that in the Old Testament there are multiple stories of welcoming the stranger, and I am not a theologian, and I am very intimidated because I know there are theologians in the audience, so I don't know the number of times in the Old Testament, but certainly Joseph and Mary were fleeing an oppressive government regime, just as many of the folks whom we on the panel and those of you in the audience welcome as well. But it's the Sermon on the Mount where Jesus says, welcome the stranger, feed the hungry, clothe the naked, but really welcome the stranger. So it is the Sermon on the Mount. And then certainly our Pope Francis has taken the issue of migration as one of the top concerns. And he says, I'll just read quickly, the kingdom of God must be built with migrants and refugees and victims of trafficking, for without them, it would not be the kingdom that God wants.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And maybe we went left to right. Should we go right to left? I'm thinking that we read in both directions. But we start. First of all, Rabbi Bara, can you introduce yourself a little bit? We forgot to do that in the beginning, so we'll say our names and like briefly our affiliation. And then the question that I'm asking is, can you tell me about some of your particular work around immigration and migration?
Hi, so sure. My name is Rabbi Bara Elman, and I'm adjunct faculty in the theology department here. I'm also, I would say I'm an activist around anti-racism work and work around migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. The latter, I have to say, was a later addition to my silos of interest, and I can actually date it to driving to Yom Kippur services, I think in 2015, and hearing an NPR report about Syrians fleeing, trying to get into Europe via Turkey and going across the channel between Turkey and Lesbos. And at this early stage, the citizens of Lesbos were actually very welcoming. It was really kind of amazing. And there was one woman who said, you know, we have a hotel and we just are offering the rooms. And someone asked her, one of the reporters asked her, are you afraid you have terrorists? And she said, you know, they come without passports. They come without anything. And I don't know who they are. So I'm just gonna house them and assume that they're not. And that was it. So what happened is that after that, my husband and I decided to go to Lesbos to volunteer with a group there to help receive people when they come in the boats. They're rubber rafts, often very flimsy. Many of the people in these boats have never seen water before, and they're terrified. And as someone whose name I don't remember now wrote in a beautiful poem about the world, talks about how you never step into an ocean when you don't know water unless it's much worse behind you. You don't do it unless what you're leaving is worse. You don't uproot your children and take them with you and risk travel across a channel unless it's worse behind you. And so these people coming were, you know, they were very, very real. And for me, and I think this is true almost for any kind of activism, when you meet somebody, once you have a person, a face attached to an issue, it becomes real in a way that you can't escape it. You see the humanity and you have to react. So from there, I've been very active around both under the Trump administration, combating the practices of ICE and DHS. I've been down to the Mexican border. I've did civil disobedience in front of DHS in Washington, and also trying to help in the most recent crisis. Actually, Adama next to me has been someone who was a program that she's fed people to homes that for overnight, a couple nights, or 1 or 2 or 3 nights, and I've been very blessed to have had numbers of people from Nicaragua, El Salvador, Colombia stay at our house, and to be able to just offer them food, shower, and a bed, and, humanity.
Yeah, you've been phenomenal. So my name is Adama Ba. I'm an immigrant rights advocate and an author. So for me, it's a lived experience. I'm formerly undocumented. I came to the United States at the age of 2. I didn't know I was undocumented till I was 16, and my apartment was raided by ICE, FBI, and NYPD. I was ultimately accused of being a potential suicide bomber. I spent 6.5 weeks in detention center. I was released under agreement of wearing an ankle bracelet and a curfew, and I would stay in New York City area. It took me 2 years to receive my asylum. If I had returned to Guinea, I would have been circumcised. Unfortunately, in Guinea-Conakry, they circumcise women. So I spent the last 16 years in this immigration system, but along the way, I needed to help the people that needed the help. The system wasn't made for us. So navigating was difficult for me. So when I knew these buses were coming, it was very important for me to be there. It was very important to have that experience and say, don't do this, do this. This can help you. This is where you can go. These are the faces that would help you. They won't help you. And so this work has been not just me. It's because of women like her and people in this audience that are Irma, who's sitting there and supporting me and helping me. You can't do this work alone. So when we talk about faith, we're all from different faiths, but we all lean on each other for support.
Yeah, so just introduce yourself briefly and the particular work that you do around migration.
My name is Shivani Parikh. I use she, her, hers pronouns. I am a second-year law student at Fordham, right next door, and I'm a member of the Stein Scholars Program for Public Interest. And that's important to me because the work I would like to do upon graduating will be South Asian civil rights advocacy, and that includes a lot of work that responds to refugee crises. The Bangladeshi community in New York City is largely their arrival has been largely predicated upon applying as refugees and asylum seekers because of the Bangladesh Liberation War in the 1970s. Many Sri Lankan Tamil refugees came here through the 90s and early 2000s because of 4 back-to-back civil wars. Similarly with the Nepali community here as well. And that, of course, harkens, if we harken back to some of the most aggrieved refugees, that would be those who were affected by the 1947 partition of India and Pakistan, where millions of people died in trying to cross the 2 borders to the country that ostensibly would accept them more because of religious division. So I think the South Asian story is a story of refugees and migration traumas, and it continues to affect the diasporic identity of what it means to belong, and regrettably many of the tensions in our community as well. But South Asian civil rights work is, I think, predicated on interfaith collaboration if we're going to go anywhere. I would say my involvement with sadhana is a consequence of recognizing that, unfortunately, many Hindu Americans are in alignment with the ongoing regime in India, which disproportionately is surveilling, targeting, harassing religious minorities and ethnic minorities, caste minorities. And it's very important as for sadhana's work and as well as our sister organization, Hindus for Human Rights, to be critical of the treatment of religious minorities in India and to hope that fellow South Asian nations reflect the same criticisms. So I think what I would really also say is that there's such a necessary analysis of transnational justice. What does it mean for us to understand the plights of those abroad in order for us to be committed to doing work in alignment here?
Thank you.
Wow, amazing stories, right? So I have been involved in immigration and migrant work for a long time. I worked with the Jesuit Refugee Service in El Salvador, working with folks who had just come back after the war. So an opportunity to work with migrants there, that was very powerful. And now in the work that I'm doing, just backing up, I also, I'm Miriam Ford, sorry.
Yeah, you're Dr. Miriam Ford.
Miriam Ford. family nurse practitioner. I also teach at Mercy College. So in my work in healthcare, one of my inspirations is Paul Farmer, who I'm sure many of you have heard about. Paul Farmer talks about accompaniment, and he talks about the word accompaniment. If you look at the Latin, it's accompan us, which is break bread together. So the points that my colleagues are making about this being a community effort and an interreligious effort is really important. So in addition to working with the Jesuit Refugee Service, some friends and I started a free clinic for undocumented immigrants in East Harlem and ran that for 10 years. And I have currently been working with the Human Rights Clinic at Mount Sinai Hospital. If there are any nurse practitioners or physicians here who are interested in getting involved, that would be great. We do physical and psychological evaluations for people applying for asylum. I've done a bunch of visits at the detention center out in Elizabeth. I'm also working through the HERC program. We can talk about the controversial HERC program that the city is running. But as a nurse practitioner in the hotels, and I had the good fortune to meet Misbah and some other folks this summer when I worked at the Port Authority and welcome people. So that's a little bit about me.
Thank you. So maybe you can speak about this briefly. How is your faith affected by your work? You know, we've talked about how our faiths compel us to do this work, but turn that around. How is your faith informed or affected or changed or challenged or enhanced by the work that you're doing?
I think that there's two answers to that question. Because the first one that comes to mind is my faith allows me to stay in the work. I think that especially when you go to a law school where 90% of your classmates are going to be working at large corporate firms and occasionally doing hopefully decent pro bono work, it can be disincentivizing to remember at times that the work that you're going to be doing in the public interest, which certainly doesn't compensate particularly well, is not only important but also critical to what it means to actually be an advocate for justice, which ostensibly is the reason why most people go to law school anyway. I also think that to have a definition of justice where you come from an immigrant community that is going to make people who are previously apolitical and to remember that, I don't know, to be a minority in a myriad of ways necessitates that you're already been politicized, so it's a matter of how you meet that challenge, is something that my faith gives me comfort in, because one of our strong concepts is dharma, or right way or the right path. And it's not necessarily to say that there is one right way or one path, but that what does it mean for you to be in alignment with the one that's been chosen for you or upon when you've discovered it. And for me, I have come to understand that faith in action, or karma yoga, is what resonates the most with me. I feel the presence of my faith or God the most when I'm doing, when I'm in alignment with social justice and helping others. I think the other thing I would say about faith is that coming from a community that is interfaith has, I think, allowed for, it's such a generational divide, I think that the traumas and biases and prejudices that my parents' generation carries, perhaps understandably, given the conditions they grew up in, but unfortunately, because they prevent us from, I think, coming together cohesively in times where, the state sees us all the same anyway. They judge us upon the color of our skin rather than, and the perception of what religion we may be. And so, for me, I think being Hindu has proven to be an interesting touch point when many of my colleagues, friends, chosen family, people who are doing the work alongside me are Muslim, Jain, Sikh, Zoroastrian. And I think the last comment that I'll make is that being, I think, from a dharmic faith in an Abrahamic society can be, I think, wearisome at times. Especially when most people's exposure to my religion has either come from poorly written textbooks or now media coverage of the Hindu right. And so what does it mean to be a Hindu leftist is a question that continues to inform and engage my work.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah. say, Rabbi? That
It's interesting. I mean, it's inseparable for me that my faith and the work I try to do are really inseparable. But I will say something about, Judaism is a weird religion in that it's both a religion and a culture. It's both a religion and an ethnicity in a sense. And so the elephant in the room is, of course, for many people, Israel is a big center of their Jewish life. And for many non-Jews, Israel seems to be what is often taken to be what Judaism is, which is unfortunate. And so I feel like one of the things that my faith also does is compels me to look there and to oppose the occupation, to oppose the right-wing swings there, because they do not reflect my faith. And I think they reflect the ethnicity in its worst form, in its sort of nationalist form. And I think that Judaism, despite the fact that it is an ethnicity and it comes from a time when land and God and religion were all too tightly wound to separate them. And that, I think, you can hang on to that without then deciding that the boundaries are so firm that you have to fight to keep them, and you have to, prevent other people from accessing them. So I think, I guess what I'm trying to say is that my faith pushes me to, to more and more and more and more and more, to leftist positions. I was actually at a talk yesterday evening by a brilliant woman. If you don't know of her work, you should look it up. Her name is Danielle Sarid. She runs an organization called Common Justice, which is about incarceration. If you're interested, I can talk about it afterwards. But she talked about the Passover story, saying that what we come out of it from is to say, never again. And of course, that line we resonate with the Shoah, that people will say, never again. But what Judaism, in its foundation, in the story of the Exodus, when they say never again at that moment, it doesn't just mean never again for us. We're never again going to be enslaved. It means never again will this happen. Never again can we permit this to happen. And never again can we allow a pharaoh, and I'm using this in the kind of mythological sense, to oppress other people. And that means us too. If we start to become the pharaoh, we have to stop that. And this country is complicit, in the sense that this country has caused a lot of the problems that have forced people to migrate from their homes. And this country has been inconsistent in its welcoming of people, and it has been inconsistent in its treatment of people that come to the borders. It's violated international law by denying asylum seekers places to stay. So if we're the pharaoh, we have to resist that, and we have to say, never again.
So for me, Islam does two things. It's my self-care and the reason why I continue going. So the work that I do, I'm constantly hearing trauma. I'm constantly hearing stories that for me, it's like, whoa, what's going on? So that moment I have to take to pray to myself to heal, because hearing trauma can be very effective. And then the point of moving on, because you can be very discouraged after a while, especially if you spend all night with a woman in an ER room who has been assaulted on her journey here, and they're telling her there's nothing we can do for you. You lose hope at some point, but then I have to remind myself why I do this. So in Islam, there's 3 ways of stopping evil. The first step is to use your hands. The second is to say stop, not actually stop, but like to say don't do that. And the last thing is to hate it in your heart. And to hate it in your heart is the lowest level. But I chose to use my voice, and I will continue to use my voice, and I'll continue to tell the stories of those who cannot speak. So for me, this faith has done a lot, and I think there's a lot of misconceptions about Islam. So when people see me in the spaces, they're like, a hijabi woman, aren't you supposed to be home? Oh. And then when they hear I have kids, they're like, wait a minute, you have kids? So I feel like I broke all stereotypes when it comes to my faith and when I'm in spaces where people don't normally see me, a Black Muslim woman.
So I talked a little bit about Paul Farmer, and Paul Farmer talks a lot about Gustavo Gutierrez, who writes about the preferential option for the poor. And that really is what has been the thread throughout my life, and going to the margins and hearing the stories, and now, quite frankly, trying to put myself in the margins so that other people can step forward. And it's instead of as a white woman with privilege here in New York City, instead of giving voice, instead of speaking other people's stories, moving to the side and trying to promote other people so they can tell their own stories. Certainly what Adama was saying about trauma, hearing the stories about trauma, particularly when we're doing the psychological evaluations and doing the physical evaluations, and you can see the scars. People do horrible things to each other. But hearing the psychological trauma, and particularly, I will say, the violence against women is just very upsetting. Being able to step back and think about Oscar Romero, who said similar to Dr. King, who said similar to many, we may not see, who said similarly to Merton, we may not see the seeds that we plant. And so it allows me to be humble and say, I just need to keep going, and I need to find people and community, and that is the other piece of my faith. It really is the breaking of the bread together as community that sustains me.
I'm thinking about how, all of the faiths that we're making reference to are, close to 1,000 years, 2,000, 5,000, 8,000, right? Like, we're talking long time frames. And when Shivani was telling the story, those two stories, like you so were able to move within them, right? Like, these stories, they're part of how you grew up, they're part of stories you heard, there's art about them, there's, and the rest of us have similar ones that you just sort of like, you always have those stories in your head as you're moving through your life, and you're able to put yourselves in them in that really Ignatian way, regardless of one's actual practice, right? Like, where am I in this story? Who am I in Exodus? Am I the Pharaoh? Crap, I better check myself, right? Like, where am I with the prophet? Who would I be in this scene, right? Like, I think we're able, if we're raised with these literatures, they kind of move around with us all the time. And so you have that frame of that literature in the present of what you're seeing, right? Who is the wandering person at the Port Authority? And not that they need to fit in, right, to the literature, but they do, because that literature is around you. So anyway, I'm thinking about that and like the long time scale that allows us. And I think one of the things that I find most frustrating in US conversations about migration and immigration in the last 5 years, 10 years, is the presentism of it, right? As though people just started showing up in Texas. And obviously, no, it's a long story. If we're focusing on Latin America, right, this is a story that begins 500 years ago with the suppression of the indigenous. Or if we want to speed it up a little bit, this is a story that begins in the 1970s with the Cold War and the US arming and training and pouring tremendous amounts of money into repressive regimes. And it's blowback, right? It's a long story that gets people here. And if we were talking about other locations as well, right? There's a lot of Haitians arriving. The US first invaded Haiti in the early part of the 1900s. These aren't, so I'm wondering, is there a way that, thinking about what is people of faith working around these political issues, is there something in particular that we can bring when we're thinking about time, when we're thinking about longevity? Maybe that's too abstract a question, but that's my thought. Is there something we bring around time?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It is a little abstract, but I'll try to do my best. I mean, I think I started out by saying that the Jewish story begins with migration. And Jews throughout our history have also been forced into migrations. Forced into migrations from the land of Israel to Babylon, from the land of Samaria, even before that, to being dispersed around the area of the Assyrian Empire, not allowed to own land in Europe, and therefore having sort of marginalized existences during the Christian era of Europe, or the Middle Ages and the Enlightenment period. Pogroms in Russia and in the other parts of what are known as Eastern Bloc that have forced people to leave their homes. And then, of course, the Holocaust, which created millions of migrants and refugees, some of whom went to Israel and some of whom came here. And not all of them were welcome in either place initially. Jews from the Arab countries, even when they went to Palestine as it was then, were often seen as second class to the European Jews. So the story is it's part of life. I mean, I said it's part of human life, and it is. People migrate. Very few people, and probably nobody, is where their earliest ancestors started. So, but in my own tradition story, it really is the story. I mean, there's a plant called the Wandering Jew. I mean, and it's for a reason, because Jews have had to wander. We're actually in one of the only times when we are not the primary people migrating. It's kind of an extraordinary phenomenon that Jews are not migrating right now, at least as Jews. They may be Latin American people who are Jewish who are migrating, but we're not migrating as Jews. So I think seeing that sweep, and again noting that in this time we're not, puts the onus on us to then say, okay, because we don't have to pack our bags, we need to have our doors open and our arms open, to just make sure that never again, that we don't ever let happen the worst that's happened to us.
I know that there's students who've been studying these texts, studying faith and action, and so I want to open up actually to a Q&A. We can come back to some of these questions, and I think there's probably questions in the audience, so why don't we move to that so that we can have some dialogue like that. So if anybody has a question, you could stand up and we could pass a microphone around. Yeah. Yes. And then you.
Thank you for the panel. I'm a New Yorker and Muslim by faith, representing Muslim community. This is New York, and as you said, we are quite homogeneous here. We are very accepting of each other. It's truly an interfaith city. But you move a little bit into the center of the country, the situation is very different. So my question is, what are the faith communities here in the more integrated and more accepting areas such as the coastlines? What are they doing, or what should we be doing to sort of convince our brethren in the other areas of America where others and the strangers are not welcome, they are not looked upon? So we need to reach out to them and see what they can do, or maybe emulate what we are doing here over there. So just I'd like to hear what the panelists have to say.
Do you want to answer that actually as somebody whose faith is super international, organized, and if we're talking about the rest of the country, it's a Christian majority rest of the country that is the part that's being unwelcoming, yeah? So what's a potential
So as the
improvement?
representative for all of Christianity, I will take on that question. I will preface it by saying that I grew up living the New Yorker cartoon. So my family emigrated from Brooklyn to New Jersey, and that was a huge thing. So thinking about the rest of the world, the rest of the country is just amazing. I just want to say a couple of comments before I answer what you've asked. The first is that I think many of us think of New York as a welcoming place, but in fact, it's not always as welcoming as it could be. And I think that's probably why many of us are here this evening, is to see how we can help make it a more welcoming place as New Yorkers, because we feel proud, and certainly as the folks got off the buses from Texas and we said, welcome to New York. It was a very powerful, and that we're so glad that you're here. It was a very powerful moment. But there are many people who are migrants throughout the city who do not feel welcomed, and who do not feel welcomed by some of the policies of our current mayor, who do not feel welcomed by the policies of our governor, who do not feel welcomed by the policies of our, as a Catholic Democrat, I will say this, as the policies of our president either. The other thing is that throughout this country, in small places that many of you may know about, there are people doing amazing work. And I did some work at the border, at the Texas-Mexico border, and people would come and they would say, I'm going to North Dakota, and I would say, North Dakota, oh my gosh. And then you would hear about this amazing community in North Dakota that was welcoming people. So I'm becoming very long-winded now, but I think that you raise a very important point that we need to demonstrate to our fellow New Yorkers, but also to the people across the country, how we can welcome New York. I don't know what people think about that new slogan they're trying to do, that we love New York instead of I love New York. I'm not crazy about it, but I like the we sense of it, that we as a community, that we want you here. I don't know if I answered any question here.
Yeah.
I can add on to that. So before this became a crisis, especially states like Denver, it was houses of worship that stepped up and helped. So when we were assisting, I'll give you an example with the Black migrants. So Black migrants, when they are detained, they are at the Mexican border, they're transported to another detention center, only Black migrants. And they're held there for weeks and months, and they have to pay a bond. Once they're released in Louisiana, there's street release. There's a church van that drives around that picks them up, regardless of their faith, drops them off at their church, and gives them phone, food, and clothing, and say, call whoever you need to call. And so in Atlanta is another place where you have, I call it the mosque, the Underground Railroad Mosque. There are mosques along that route that literally house migrants until they get to New York City. So there are a lot of houses of worship that are doing it, but they're, especially here in New York, right now there's 12 mosques that are housing migrants. Only 4 are public, and we know why. The backlash, the questions, and why are you housing these migrants? What's going on? The charges. But houses of worship have really stepped up and have done what the country should, what the state and federal government should be doing. But let's also be honest, there are houses of worship that are not friendly, that are not welcoming. But with this experience, I have to say I've gotten great response. Even when we're sending people to other states, I'm not calling organizations. I'm calling a pastor, a rabbi, or priest, and like, hey, this is what I need. So houses of worship have honestly been doing really good with this crisis.
I just have to push in one more thing, because this mayor has said to a group of clergy on a Zoom a couple weeks ago on a different topic that he wants houses of worship to take the lead on these projects that he is not funding. And while it's wonderful, and I'm proud, and I think every house of worship should be doing this kind of work, I believe that this is our government's obligation, because it's our money, it's our tax money when the government is doing things. It's not like they're doing something. It's our money is being allocated, and we should be allowed to, it should be used for these kinds of values. So I know that this isn't a political thing, but I want to just reiterate that this should be a municipal program.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. And I think that interplay, right, between what are the houses, it's always grassroots that do the very direct work. There's these all kinds of networks between and among religions that, yeah, you can pick up the phone and call and, right? Here's some church in Buffalo, right, that you can get people connected to. But really it's the work that the state should be doing, right? Like we want to be able to have the faith communities doing frontline work, informing the values, pushing the agenda of welcome, but we don't want to let the state abdicate its responsibilities, right? The state always, 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 always has enough money for war. It always has enough money for war. It always has enough money for war. It has enough money for the wars that created all these refugees. And then it never has enough money to heal, to host, to train, to help. There is always enough money for war. There will be enough money for the next one too. And then when there's this kind of work, it's, well, we really need the faith communities to step up. Of course the faith communities will step up because that's what we believe. But how do we make sure that happens without letting the state off the hook, the government off the hook? But I want to make sure the students can ask a question or talk.
Sorry, I took the long way. Hi, I'm a student in Professor Kueny's class, and it's been amazing to hear all of you talk. I had a question. I know, one aspect of the class and just in general when talking about religion, I feel like there's a lot of self-reflection and kind of being able to critique, the faiths that you follow and seeing where inconsistencies lie. So my question was, are there any aspects or, passages in the text of your faith that contradict or cause tensions with the work that you're doing? And if so, how do you kind of work through that?
That's a good question.
Yes, yes. I will just tell you now, and I told this to my students last week, that if you ever think you want to do a year of living biblically, read it first, okay? Really, read it first, because there's a lot. The biblical tradition is ancient. Its earliest material comes from about 1100 BCE, and the most recent comes from about 150 BCE, and there are different values. Homosexuality is condemned straight out in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy, okay? That was culturally what was deemed wrong. I don't think that's what God said. I think that's what people understood, what they thought God said. We also have laws in Deuteronomy, which unfortunately is a pretty genocidal book, that you exterminate all the people in the land when you get there, because they will be a snare to you, and they will cause you to lose your way and not worship the right God. I don't think that's a God statement. I think that's a parochial statement from a political time that has something to do with something other than faith. I could go on. I mean, there are a lot of things. And for me, I mean, I'm a professor, my field is biblical tradition. I'm comfortable saying that my sacred text, my scripture, is the human interpretation of a revelation that happened. We don't have access to that actual revelation. All we have is the interpretation. And I'll just give one great proof text of this for this. When Moses is told by God that God is going to come to Sinai to speak to the people, God says to Moses, tell the people I'm coming in 3 days, purify yourself and wash your clothes. And Moses goes down and says, God is coming in 3 days, wash your clothes, don't go near a woman. So I'll just leave it with that, and you can think about what that means.
Definitely yes here. So in Islam, to identify in the LGBTQ community is not haram, is the act that makes it forbidden. So I'm over here advocating for trans and LGBTQ, and so I contradict, and I know I get a lot of heat within the Muslim community, but they are human beings, and if they don't have a bed, I will advocate for them. If they don't feel safe, I would advocate for them. So, yes.
I think that there are, the reason I'm hesitating is again, because like for example, even the Bhagavad Gita, like there's, I think there's a part in there that legitimizes caste and casteism, which like I vehemently disagree with. There's also just like examples littered throughout things that don't have to be taken instructionally, but when we don't criticize them, they get enveloped into what's deemed acceptable. An excellent example of this is in the Mahabharata. There's a young man named Eklavya who is watching this like guru who knows like all these different forms of warfare teach Arjuna, who's like one of the 5 princes that's like going to become king someday with his 4 brothers, like how to shoot bows and arrows. And Eklavya, I can't quite remember if he was Dalit or if he just wasn't of the warrior caste, but irrespectively, it was like forbidden for him to watch that instruction because he's not entitled to that knowledge. Like again, bearing in mind, when this story took place and the ways which caste was an integral part of the division of society. So they cut off his thumb. So even though he knew how to shoot a bow and arrow, he would never be able to do so. And that was the consequence of him trying to, to circumvent the limitations of his caste. Those are just, I think, 2. And then maybe the third one I would give is that the Mahabharata is this allegorical war where Arjuna has to, fight his own family, and so the god Krishna comes down and explains to him why it's a righteous fight, even if the people that he has to fight against are his not his relatives, his gurus, his countrymen. And that has been wildly misinterpreted to now condone the Hindu rights government decisions in India as like a legitimizing narrative for the heinous acts that are being committed. So I would say my gripe, it seems similar across faiths, is more like everybody has, I think, their prejudices and beliefs, and then they choose selectively which parts of their faith reinforce their bigotry. And so how do we become, I think, especially as lay people, how do we respond to that? Because I think what's most dangerous is people that become clergy often are people who say things that lay people want to hear. And so it's our responsibility more than anyone else's to make sure that our religious leadership and our fellow faith followers are held to higher standards.
Yeah, I don't know. You don't have to if you.
I mean, I guess the thing I would say is that I am very careful about identifying myself as a Catholic in the tradition of Dorothy Day, Oscar Romero, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that that is because of the conservatism and the oppression of groups within groups in the world by Catholics, by Christians. Certainly looking back to the Crusades. So talking about welcoming LGBTQ folks, trans folks, and that all are welcome. And in fact, when we say all are welcome, they lose their stranger cape and they become one of us. And that's really what we are looking for, I would posit, in all of our faiths.
Hi, thanks for all this discussion. It's really fascinating. I want to get back to something that a couple of you have alluded to and ask you to talk about it more explicitly. I'm Jewish, so I'll speak for myself. Within my religion, within the Jewish people, let's just say in America, because that's what I know, there are certainly groups of Jews who are very unsympathetic to what we are doing. Sometimes it's by way of their political approach. Sometimes it's more explicitly religious. And I think all of you have talked at some point about how you're sort of up against other groups within your faith community. I guess 2 things. One is, what do you, as a person of faith, what do you do with that? And also, if you have any suggestions or any approaches to offer, what do you do about it, if anything? What's your approach in the real world?
Right. How do you witness somewhat against, right, the prevailing attitudes or things you disagree with? But I'll ask everybody to actually be super brief so that we can privilege the students' questions and make sure we get a couple more of them.
Can I jump in quickly? Just briefly, I think community is the answer. You have to have community. A friend of mine is here tonight, Dr. Martin Carney, who brought 2 friends and colleagues from Fordham Prep, and I think building community and bringing people along is the only way to counteract all of this.
I think I would also tack on, like, my relationship with God is not for these people to have credibility over. So I think that is what gives me peace. I mean, Hinduism is a religion that believes in reincarnation. So I'm like, my karmic scales are not being weighed by these people, but by I think a God that sees my intentions. And so I take refuge in that.
Same for me. I think my faith, everyone has opinion how to practice your faith. I'm going to practice the way I feel comfortable and I know, and I'll let God judge me. Even within, I'll give you 3 quick stories. There's a young Jewish Iranian woman who recently came out to me that she's Jewish. There's a few sects in Iran who practice. She's been hiding it from me because she thought I would hate her. There's an Eritrean man whose family been murdered by Muslims. He was afraid to tell me where he was from because he thought I was going to act the same way. There's a Turkish young boy who was afraid to tell me that he was gay because he thought I would hate him. So I'm breaking those stereotypes and saying, well, not me. I don't care what everybody else says, but not me. And then I'm bringing that community of other people who feel the same and say, well, I know a sister named Jamila. Why don't you contact her? I know a sister named Kujeju. Why don't you contact her? She doesn't feel the same way that the others feel.
Yeah, that's basically the answer. I mean, every single religion has its spectrum from, most extreme and fundamentalist to most liberal and loose. So I don't tend to think that it's so much of a religion question as, I mean, I definitely want to, advocate for progressive Judaism, but more than that, I'm just, I want to be in community with people outside of my religious tradition, and hopefully, people who disagree will learn and maybe be open to thinking in different ways.
One of the things I was struck by when I was pre-interviewing all these panelists to basically answer some versions of these questions and so that we would know how we wanted to talk, is several of them volunteered my religion is the thing that keeps me able to continue doing this work, right? I do this work because of how I feel or because of my political beliefs or my personal experiences, but the thing that allows me to keep doing it, each of these people said, is the fact that I have this far deeper, far longer scale relationship with God that allows me to keep going. And anyway, so I think that's actually part of the answer, that often the people that are doing so much work have this longer, deeper connection that allows them to. But then there's so many entry points, right? So many entry points for people who want to participate. And maybe you could just say the names of some organizations that, or if somebody wanted to go next week and help 1, 2, 3, 4, where would you send them?
I would send them to Ibiza in the Bronx. There are about 140 Black migrants living in the mosque that need help with social services. I would contact AAA, Artists After the Activists. I would contact Team TLC. I would contact Fundaveic. I would contact EV Loves. These are all grassroots organizations that have been on the ground since day one. They have been greeting migrants before the buses came We've been doing this work for years. So sorry.
Mine is less cosmic, but I actually asked, my students did a thing on immigration and refugees and asylum seekers in a presentation on Monday, or no, last Wednesday. And one of the things we did on Monday was I asked them to brainstorm about what they could do. You know, given the fact that that your students, you know, you don't have a lot of maybe space or available wealth and time and connections. So one of the things you can do is talk about the situation and try to let people know that, you know, that the migrant population are human people, you know, and make that story visible, and so that the people who are not, those voices that are allowing the city to object to providing housing and support are going to stop doing that. So just share what you're learning as widely as you can, and the ripple effect will have some value.
I thought I would just say two things. The first I would say is consider a career in public service, and like committing your life's work to helping others, whether that's through the migration crisis or through other ways. The other thing that I will say is that if that's not possible, and I always recognize that, you know, different folks have different financial and familial obligations, what does it look like for you to integrate a long-term commitment into this work? For some attorneys who go to the private sector, that looks like their pro bono work. But I think that, you know, whether that's like utilizing your language skills that you may have to making yourself available there, it sounds like you can volunteer to host migrants at your home, being a regular voter. But I think it's really important that like the spirit of civic engagement doesn't leave you when you leave school, because it's really easy to get stuck in this grind of like, oh, I already have to work from 9 to 5, and then I have to like cook for myself, do the dishes, and do laundry. And like between all of that and socializing with my friends Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, like I don't really have time to volunteer. And like I think that like especially as young people, like we more than anybody else have a responsibility to like modeling a long-term desire to make our society better.
1,000%. I keep going back to community, because I think it's very easy, particularly as a young person, particularly as a student, to feel isolated and overwhelmed. And I think about, I can tell you how old I am, but my generation, and we haven't done enough. And so when you talk about the responsibility of your generation, you know, my generation has to keep on going, because we haven't left the planet in great shape, and we haven't done a lot of the things that we need to do, but certainly building community. I'm also happy to give out my email. Organizations are always looking for translators if you speak a second language. There are lots of organizations looking for translation, and there are lots of people, lots of small groups all over the city, pockets of groups. We are just a microcosm of what's going on in the city. It's amazing. And so instead of feeling overwhelmed, grab a friend and say, okay, we're gonna investigate this. And the other part about being in community is, in the long haul, is you can say, you know what, right now I need to rest, but I know that our community is working on this together, and then I will take the baton up and let you rest.
Very practically, on Monday nights at St. Francis Xavier Church on 16th Street, Project Rousseau is operating. It's you know, mutual aid, very grassroots. Was housed for a while up at Ascension in the 90s on the Upper West Side. But when newly arrived migrants were put in hotels all around the city, a bunch of mutual aid groups, many of them operating out of parishes, many operating out of other houses of worship, sprung into action to help people get enrolled in school, right? Help people get their kids enrolled in school, get people food. The city was providing food, but it was like bad school lunch food. To get people connected to legal services, to help people get enrolled in the benefits that they could qualify for, things as simple as ID NYC and cheap Metro cards. And so anyway, like really practically, Monday night, if you want to come down to Xavier on 16th Street, which is like at an F stop, you can go into the basement, where they have forever run a giant you know, soup kitchen program, food pantry program, clothing program, a ton of things for people who are homeless, but now are also doing this work with newly arrived migrants. So there's like a clothing area, right? So people are donating clothes and they need to be sorted so that when some mom comes in and needs size 7 clothes for a kid and size 10 for the other kid, they're there. And translation services and hooking people up with legal aid, with legal assistance. And so that can happen, right? And part of that, what I love about that particular little program is that there's like the really basic families who are staying in hotels, having just walked here, come and hang out and like play board games and like play cards with the kids and like do coloring and do like normal happy things that you don't need a degree for, and you don't need to get into like stuff that's above your ability, right? But you're like, oh, I can play cards with some kids and have like that kid had a nice time this night. And then I can also keep doing the higher level policy work, right? You know, and I think the thing that like saves us from despair is actually the very small, not all that dramatic things. Like, all right, so I sorted a bunch of size 7 jeans today. It doesn't seem like it's gonna solve climate change and global war, but I did do that, and I hung out with that woman who walked here with her kids. And now the world is a little bit less despairing, and that doesn't let me off the hook. That doesn't mean I don't have to vote. That doesn't mean I don't have to advocate. That doesn't mean I shouldn't be hooked up with these very well-organized, much larger structural organizations, like Catholic Migration Service is a major one, right? There's all these things working for big policy structural change. That needs to happen. But you feel less overwhelmed when you're also doing it at this level. Yeah.
And it's important to talk about the work that you're doing, if whatever kind of volunteer work you're doing, because that's how we start to make policy and change minds. And, you know, just thinking about, we want to get people out of the shadow economy and get people work permits. The only way that can happen is at the federal level. So how do we, you know, you could just kind of put your blanket over your head and watch Netflix because it just feels so overwhelming. But how do we do that? We start to talk to other people, and then we get groups of people, and we get members of the New York State Senate and Assembly pushing. So we need to keep talking.
Yeah. Like those changes happen, right? Like TPS was extended for certain Haitians this year. That didn't happen because people were overwhelmed, right? It happened because Haitian refugees, right? Haitian Women for Haitian Refugees and a bunch of other longstanding organizations pushed to make sure TPS would get extended. Yeah. So there's practical work and there's policy work, and I think it might be time to pray. Yeah. I felt like I think it might be time to wrap us up so that we can break fast, yes? Yeah, good, thank you. Yeah.
So thanks, everyone. I wanted to give a shout out to my class for about what we've been doing in the class as a form of thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for coming. And I want to introduce Alex.
عليكم. الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله